In the earliest centuries of Rome, long before the marble colonnades and triumphal arches, there was a tale whispered of an old woman who appeared at the city's gates. She wore threadbare robes, her hair gray and tangled, yet her eyes shone with something otherworldly. She carried with her 9 scrolls wrapped tightly in cloth, claiming that within them were prophecies of immeasurable value, secrets of gods and mortals alike. When she was brought before King Tarquinius Superbus, the 7th and final king of Rome, she named her price. It was so absurdly high that the court burst into laughter. The king dismissed her as a fraud, a mad wanderer peddling nonsense. But she did not argue, simply nodded, left the chamber, and set 3 of the scrolls ablaze before the eyes of all who followed her outside. The parchment crackled, smoke curling into the sky, carrying with it whatever wisdom had been written there. When she returned with 6, her demand was the same. The king again refused, mocking her audacity, and again she burned 3 scrolls, this time without a word. The crowd grew restless. Some whispered that she was no ordinary woman. Some thought her an oracle, perhaps even a sibyl. One of the women known throughout the Greek world for speaking with the voices of gods. Still, the king would not yield. He would not pay a fortune for what he believed was trickery. Yet, when she returned a 3rd time, now holding only 3 scrolls, still insisting on the same price, something in Tarquinius changed. Perhaps it was the way the flames had consumed the others. Perhaps it was the silence of the crowd, uneasy at what had been lost. He relented. He purchased the final 3, though at that moment he surely wondered if he had been made a fool. As soon as the transaction was complete, the woman vanished. No one saw her again, and no one knew her name. Some believed she had been a mortal touched by the gods, others that she was a goddess herself, testing Rome's pride. What mattered were the scrolls, now in the king's possession, and soon entrusted to priests whose sole duty would be their guardianship. These texts would become known as the Sibylline Books, though they were not books in our sense of the word. They were scrolls, written in Greek hexameter, filled with dense and cryptic verse. They were not histories, nor poems, nor instructions, but prophecies. And like all prophecies, they spoke in riddles, cloaked in layers of meaning that could only be unraveled when the time was right. To safeguard them, Rome appointed keepers, the duoveri sacris facientes, men chosen to watch over the scrolls with absolute secrecy. Their duty was sacred, for these texts were not to be handled lightly. They were consulted only in moments of dire crisis, when famine gripped the city, when plague swept through its streets, when the gods seemed to turn their faces away. In such times, the Senate would decree that the books be opened, and the priests would descend into the temple vaults, where the scrolls lay hidden. Unrolling the fragile parchment to search for divine instruction, the verses, obscure as they were, might advise new sacrifices, foreign rituals, or the introduction of gods unknown to Rome. It was through these verses that the city believed it could mend its bond with the divine. The secrecy surrounding the Sibylline Books was as important as the words themselves. Ordinary Romans never saw the prophecies, never heard them recited in full. To the people, they were mystery incarnate, a sealed voice of the gods. They only knew the outcomes that after the consultation, new rites might be performed, strange altars might be raised, or delegations might be sent abroad to import sacred cults into Rome. In this way, the books were not only a guide for emergencies, but a channel through which Rome expanded its religious landscape, absorbing new traditions into its growing identity. The first major use of the Sibylline Books came not long after their arrival, when ominous signs unsettled the city. Reports of unnatural events spread, animals born with deformities, lightning striking sacred trees, voices heard in the night. Rome feared that the gods were sending warnings. The priests, urged by the Senate, consulted the scrolls. The verses spoke of the need to reconcile with foreign powers of divinity. From Greece, new rites were introduced. It was said that Rome's strength would lie not in rejecting outside influences, but in weaving them into its own traditions. Already, the Sibylline Books were shaping the destiny of a city that would someday rule the Mediterranean. What made them so compelling was not only what they said, but the aura that clung to them. They were seen as a living link between the mortal and divine. The fact that so much had been burned made them even more precious. People whispered about the lost scrolls. What prophecies had gone up in smoke? What warnings had been erased forever by the stubbornness of Tarquinius? The absence itself gave weight to the three that remained, as though the ones spared were the most important of all. It was a peculiar arrangement. Urim held in its possession prophecies it could not freely read, locked away until catastrophe forced their unveiling. In that way, they were both a comfort and a burden. For as much as they promised divine guidance, they also promised mystery, uncertainty, and the nagging possibility that even in crisis their advice might be misunderstood. But Rome embraced them all the same, for they offered something few cities had. A direct line, however, veiled to the gods themselves. Generations passed, and the scrolls outlived the monarchy. They became a fixture of the new republic, protected by tradition, consulted by priests whose names are mostly forgotten to history. In times of turmoil, citizens looked to the temple, waiting for word that the Sibylline Books had spoken. Their secrecy lent them weight, their mystery lent them power. They were never common things, never public property. They were treasures that belonged to the city itself, to be used not for profit, not for curiosity, but for survival. It is important to remember that Rome, especially in its early days, was deeply superstitious. Omens were everywhere. The flight of birds, the entrails of sacrificed animals, the rumble of thunder all were interpreted as messages. But the Sibylline Books were something greater. They were not fleeting signs in the natural world. They were permanent, written testimony of the gods' intentions, a voice preserved across centuries. They stood apart from augury and haruspicy, giving Rome a sacred anchor in times when the very ground beneath the Republic felt unstable. Still, their role was never straightforward. The verses were too obscure to give simple answers. Often they required interpretation. Sometimes they seemed contradictory. And occasionally their guidance led to strange, even uncomfortable decisions. It was through them that Rome accepted the cult of Cybele, the Great Mother, during a time of crisis. It was through them that Apollo's worship was established in the city, a Greek god folded into the Roman heart. Each time the Sibylline Books reminded Rome that its fate was not isolated, that the gods demanded connections across seas and cultures. Thus the scrolls, born from the fire of rejection and purchased at the price of arrogance, became a quiet but steady influence on Roman religion. They were not consulted often, but when they were, the results were profound. And as the Republic grew, so too did the weight of those fragile parchments stored in their temple vaults. For each crisis seemed to confirm the old woman's bargain that what Rome had purchased was not trickery, but the closest thing a mortal city could hold to the voice of eternity. In the early centuries of the Republic, Rome was still fragile, caught between neighboring enemies and the unrest of its own people. Famine struck more than once, shaking the faith of citizens who looked to their leaders for answers. When the harvests failed and the Tiber ran low, the Senate turned to the guardians of the Sibylline Books. The priests descended into the temple vault. Unrolling the sacred scrolls by torchlight, the Greek verses dancing in the flickering glow, they sought meaning in the rhythm of the lines, and what they brought back to the Senate was not a promise of plenty, but instructions. The gods demanded rites of appeasement, foreign rituals never before seen in Rome. Sacrifices were made, hymns recited, and new cults introduced. Slowly, as though the divine hand had relented, the famine passed. For the people of Rome, this was proof enough. The Sibylline Books were not empty riddles. They had power, yet that power was not in predicting exact futures, but in steering the city toward action rituals, ceremonies, and new bonds with the divine. Rome learned that survival sometimes required humility, even the humility to borrow from foreign lands. For a people so proud of their traditions, it was a difficult but necessary lesson. The Sibylline Books became the quiet mediators, urging Rome to open its gates not only to armies and trade, but to the gods of others. One of the earliest recorded interventions came in the year 496 BCE, during a desperate war with the Latins. Rome was losing, its soldiers weary, and its leaders uncertain. The priests consulted the Sibylline Books, and the verses declared that if Rome wished for victory, must vow a temple to Castor and Pollux, the divine twins of Greek legend. Obedient to the command, the Senate made the vow. Soon after, in the thick of battle at Lake Regillus, legends say the twins themselves appeared on horseback, shining with divine radiance, rallying the Roman line. When the dust settled and Rome stood victorious, few doubted the books had spoken truth. The temple was built, and Castor and Pollux became part of Rome's religious fabric. What is striking is how naturally Rome accepted such expansions of its faith. Unlike some cultures that guarded their gods jealously, Rome saw divinity as abundant, not limited. If the Sibylline books instructed them to welcome new deities, they did so, believing that strength came from honoring as many powers as possible. In times of crisis, this willingness to adopt gave Rome resilience. The books were not simply oracles, they were architects of Rome's religious diversity, whispering that survival required openness. But the books also demanded costly acts. When pestilence struck in the 5th century BCE, the verses advised that statues of Apollo be brought from Greece and new festivals established in his honor. Such measures were controversial. Why should Romans, proud and stubborn, pay homage to a foreign god? Yet when the rituals were performed, the plague lifted. Once again, the city saw divine confirmation. Skepticism could not compete with relief. With each success, the Sibylline books tightened their grip on Rome's imagination. The role of the guardians grew accordingly. At first only 2 men, their number was expanded to 10, and later to 15, forming the quindecimbri sacris facendis. These were not ordinary priests, but men of rank, often senators, entrusted with the most sacred responsibility. To be one of the 15 was an honor, but it also meant carrying the burden of secrets no one else could know. For within those scrolls, there may have been warnings Rome never dared to read unless desperation forced it. The books guided not just war and famine, but also the rhythms of ritual life. They prescribed the introduction of new festivals, adjustments to old rites, and the appeasement of divine anger. When lightning struck temples or comets burned across the sky, the Sibylline verses were sought. They were not always easy to interpret. Their Greek was archaic, their phrasing deliberately ambiguous, and their meaning often obscured by layers of metaphor. But in that obscurity lay their power. The Senate could shape their interpretation as needed, and the people, never seeing the scrolls themselves, trusted that the gods had spoken. In times of military peril, their influence was especially strong. When Hannibal marched against Rome during the Second Punic War, fear gripped the Republic. Strange omens were reported across Italy: rains of stones, rivers running with blood, the birth of monstrous animals. The Sibylline books were consulted, and the verses demanded new rituals of purification, sacrifices to unfamiliar gods, and the expansion of sacred games to appease divine forces. Rome obeyed, and though Hannibal ravaged Italy, the city endured. The books had not promised victory, but they had fortified Rome's spirit. The most dramatic episode came in 205 BCE, when the books declared that Rome could only defeat Carthage if it brought the Great Mother. Cybele, from her home in Asia Minor, the Senate sent emissaries to Pessinus, where her sacred stone was kept, and brought it across the sea to Italy. When Cybele arrived, she was welcomed with a festival unlike any before, drums pounding, priests chanting in ecstatic devotion. It was a shocking departure from Roman restraint, but it was obeyed because the Sibylline books had ordered it. The following year, Scipio sailed for Africa, and within 2 years Carthage lay broken. By then, the Sibylline books had become woven into Rome's destiny. They were no longer seen as Greek curiosities, but as sacred treasures, pillars of the Republic's survival. Their consultation marked the gravest moments, when all else seemed uncertain. And though their verses were obscure, their influence was concrete, visible in temples erected, gods adopted, and victories secured. They became part of Rome's self-image. Not only was the city strong by arms, but it was favored by the gods, guided through the darkness by divine counsel. Yet, secrecy was both their shield and their vulnerability. Because the books could not be widely read, their authority was absolute but also fragile. If the guardians were ever corrupt, if their interpretations were ever twisted, who could challenge them? The people relied entirely on the honesty of the few. In this way, the Sibylline books were both sacred oracle and instrument of politics, wielded by those in power to shape the will of Rome. And so, their legend grew not only from what was written within, but from how they were used. Through centuries of crisis, the Sibylline books remained untouched in their vaults until needed, their fragile scrolls waiting for the right moment to speak. Each consultation seemed to confirm that Rome's fate was intertwined with their riddles. They were not fortune-telling curiosities, but living instruments of the divine, urging Rome always toward survival, even if survival required change. And as the Republic grew larger, stronger, and prouder, the silent scrolls rested, waiting for the next time the city trembled and their voice was needed once more. As Rome expanded, conquering territories far beyond the Italian peninsula, the Sibylline Books remained quietly at the center of its spiritual life. They were consulted rarely, but when the Senate declared it necessary, the guardians would gather, solemn and deliberate, to unseal the scrolls. By this time, the original duoviary had long been replaced by the 15 guardians. Men drawn from noble families, entrusted with a task that no one else in the Republic could perform, they alone would descend into the vault, and they alone would interpret what the verses meant. In their hands lay not only the fate of Rome, but the careful balance between religion and politics. The secrecy surrounding the scrolls was almost absolute. Not even the Senate could read the words directly. They heard only what the priests reported. This veil of mystery protected the authority of the books, but it also meant that interpretation was everything. The verses were not clear commandments. They were riddles, couched in poetic ambiguity. The guardians had to decide whether a line referred to a sacrifice, a foreign god, or perhaps a festival to be established. It gave them immense power, though that power was cloaked in ritual humility. Stories began to circulate about the dangers of tampering with the books. It was said that any unauthorized attempt to read them was punishable by death. The scrolls were sacred, belonging not to any one man, but to Rome itself. Their words were too potent to be left in ordinary hands. For centuries, this rule was respected, and the Sibylline Books remained veiled in secrecy, consulted only in times of grave crisis. It was as if the city had locked away its most precious treasure, one that could be touched only when the gods demanded it. Yet the guardians were not mere caretakers. They were often political figures, men with influence beyond their priestly duties. The line between divine interpretation and political maneuvering could blur. A verse urging the introduction of a foreign cult could be framed as divine necessity, but it could also serve Rome's diplomatic aims. In this way, the Sibylline Books became a subtle instrument of statecraft. Their obscurity gave the Senate a divine pretext for decisions it wished to make, and the people, reassured by the sacred authority, accepted the outcomes without question. Still, the priests themselves seem to have treated their task with awe. Accounts describe them approaching the books with solemn rites, making sacrifices before unrolling the fragile scrolls, and reading by lamplight in the stillness of the temple chambers. The verses were not just words. They were the whispers of gods captured in ink. To misinterpret them was to risk divine anger. Thus, while politics was always near, there remained a genuine sense of reverence, a belief that the Sibylline Books were more than tools. They were a living bond between Rome and eternity. This bond was tested in times of disaster. During years when floods consumed the low-lying parts of the city, or when pestilence swept through the crowded streets, it was to the books that leaders turned. They sought reassurance that the gods had not abandoned them, and the books gave direction. Sometimes that direction was strange, even unsettling, but Rome obeyed. The trust placed in the books was immense, because to ignore them was to invite ruin. Over time, the presence of foreign gods in Rome became a testament to their guidance. Apollo, Cybele, Demeter, and others found their way into Roman worship because the Sibylline Books had commanded it. Each arrival was wrapped in solemn ceremony, often marked by the construction of new temples. These gods were not seen as rivals to Jupiter, Mars, or Venus, but as allies in the endless task of keeping Rome secure. In this way, the books subtly reshaped the Roman religious landscape, weaving Greek and Eastern traditions into the heart of the city. The guardians themselves became almost mythic figures, known not for their individual deeds but for their collective role. They were seen as keepers of secrets too holy for ordinary men. Their presence was a reminder that within Rome's walls lay wisdom written long ago, sealed away, waiting for moments of need. They held a burden unlike any other, for the fate of the Republic could hinge on how they interpreted a single line of Greek verse. It was in their care that the book survived fire and war, though not without close calls. The Temple of Jupiter, where the scrolls were housed, burned more than once. And each time, there was fear that the prophecies had been lost. But the Romans, ever pragmatic, claimed that the scrolls were preserved, either saved from the flames or recopied from memory. Whether true or not, the belief itself mattered. The Sibylline Books could not be destroyed, not while Rome still stood. As centuries passed, the aura around the books deepened. They were no longer just a set of scrolls purchased in some forgotten bargain with a mysterious woman. They had become symbols of Rome's destiny, as sacred as the Palladium that protected Troy. Just as the Greeks had believed that the fate of their city was tied to a single image, the Romans believed their own survival was tied to these prophetic verses. They were not public, not visible, but their presence was felt in every crisis survived. In this way, the Sibylline Books were both fragile and eternal fragile, as parchment that could crumble at a touch, eternal as the trust Rome placed in them. Their secrecy made them untouchable, their obscurity made them unquestionable, and their history made them sacred. They were a paradox, both intensely human and undeniably divine. Purchased in a bargain of fire and silence that echoed across centuries, and yet, as Rome grew stronger and prouder, as its armies marched farther and its borders stretched wider, the role of the Sibylline Books began to change. They were still consulted, still revered, but now they stood not just as guides in times of crisis, but as tools of empire. The gods, it seemed, had given Rome not only a destiny, but also a means of shaping its image, and the books were at the heart of that transformation. By the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, Rome was no longer just a city fighting for survival on the Italian peninsula. It was a rising power, its armies pushing outward, its ambitions stretching across the Mediterranean. With each conquest came new wealth, new enemies, and new anxieties. And whenever omens grew dark or disasters struck, the Sibylline Books were summoned once again. They had become the compass in the storm, guiding Rome not only through natural calamities, but through the turbulent politics of empire. In these years, reports of prodigies multiplied. Rains of stones, statues, weeping blood, eclipses at strange hours, were interpreted as signs of divine unrest. The guardians of the books were called, and the verses suggested rituals of appeasement. Often these involved introducing foreign rites, but the authority of the books overrode hesitation. Yet, if the scrolls demanded it, Rome obeyed, and thus the city's pantheon grew ever more complex. It was in this period that Apollo's worship deepened in Rome. Long associated with prophecy and healing, became one of the city's adopted protectors, brought in through the urging of the Sibylline verses. The introduction of his cult was not just religious, but political. To honor Apollo was to align Rome with the Greek world. It was slowly dominating, turning conquest into connection. Once again, the books had not merely saved Rome from crisis, they had shaped its identity. Yet even as the books guided Rome outward, they remained vulnerable. The temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, their resting place, burned more than once. Each time, stories circulated that the scrolls had been destroyed. Each time the Senate claimed that the words had been preserved, either rescued from the flames or restored from copies. Whether true or exaggerated, these claims mattered less than the belief itself. To lose the Sibylline Books would have been to lose Rome's divine anchor. The insistence that they survived, even against fire, only strengthened their myth. During the Punic Wars, when Hannibal's armies terrorized Italy, the Sibylline Books were consulted repeatedly. Omens of disaster filled the air, and the verses were interpreted as commands for Rome to cleanse itself, to seek divine favor through new festivals and sacrifices. The importation of the Great Mother from Asia Minor Cybele, whose black stone arrived in Rome in 204 BCE, was perhaps the most dramatic example. The Sibylline Books had spoken, and Rome obeyed, introducing a cult that was ecstatic, foreign, and unlike anything its citizens had known. Within a few years, Carthage was destroyed. The connection was obvious. By now, the books were more than prophecy. They were Rome's justification for dramatic religious shifts. Without them, the Senate might have faced resistance to foreign rights. For them, it could claim divine necessity. The people accepted even the strangest rituals when they came wrapped in the authority of the Sibylline verses. This gave the books an influence far beyond their physical fragility. They were both the city's safety net and its tool of adaptation. enabling Rome to remain flexible in belief while unyielding in power. The secrecy of the verses remained intact. Even at the height of their use, the people never saw them, never heard them read aloud. They knew only that the priests had consulted the scrolls and returned with instructions. The rest was trust or fear. In that silence lay the true power of the Sibylline Books, for who could question what no one else could see? The priests themselves became symbols of unchallengeable authority, their word carrying the weight of the gods. And yet cracks began to show, as the Republic descended into internal strife, as ambitious generals vied for power. The books could be called upon for political ends. A vague prophecy could be interpreted in ways that suited the moment, and the people never allowed to hear the original verses had little choice but to believe what they were told. The Sibylline Books were still sacred, but they were also becoming instruments in the struggles of men. The most dangerous aspect of this transformation was the belief that Rome's survival was inseparable from the books themselves. To destroy them would be to unravel the city's fate. They became, in essence, a relic as holy as any temple or statue. The city that had once mocked an old woman's demand for payment now clung desperately to the scraps of prophecy she had left behind. And in times of turmoil, their secrecy made them both untouchable and ripe for manipulation. Still, the people took comfort in them. When fear spread, when plague struck, when rumors of divine anger circulated, the announcement that the Sibylline Books had been consulted offered reassurance. Even if the prescribed rituals were strange, even if they brought foreign gods into the heart of Rome, the people believed the city was again aligned with the divine order. The books gave a sense of control in a world of uncertainty, and perhaps that was their greatest gift. The Sibylline Books did not prevent disasters, nor did they guarantee victory. But they offered a path, however strange, through the storm. They told Rome that the gods still spoke, that the city was not abandoned, that through obedience, harmony could be restored. In a republic racked by conflict, that message was more powerful than any prophecy of victory. It was in this age of crisis, as Rome's ambitions strained against its traditions, that the Sibylline Books became not just guardians of the past, but guides to the future. They had begun as 3 fragile scrolls purchased in arrogance and secrecy. But now they had become inseparable from the Republic's very sense of destiny. And though they remained locked in their vault, their influence stretched across the seas, shaping the empire that was slowly, inexorably coming into being. The Sibylline Books had already outlived wars and famines when disaster finally came close to ending their story. In the year 83 BCE, during the chaos of Rome's civil wars, the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus caught fire. Flames consumed the great structure, licking across its roof and collapsing its columns in a roar of smoke. For centuries, the books had been kept safe in its vaults, hidden beneath layers of stone and ritual. But now the temple itself was reduced to rubble. It was said that the Sibylline Books, the heart of Rome's prophetic tradition, had been lost in the inferno. The news struck the city like a death knell. Rome without the Sibylline Books was like a ship without a rudder. The people whispered in panic, had the gods abandoned them? Was the pact struck so long ago with the mysterious woman finally broken? Without the scrolls, how could Rome hope to weather the storms of crisis? Even the Senate, which often cloaked itself in pragmatism, recognized the danger. To admit the books were gone was to admit that Rome's divine shield had vanished. Something had to be done. The solution was as audacious as it was desperate. Envoys were dispatched across the Mediterranean to gather fragments of prophecy. Hymns and oracles from every corner of the known world, from Greece, from Asia Minor, from Africa, from Italy itself, they collected scrolls, verses, and sayings attributed to Sibyls. These were brought back to Rome, examined carefully by priests, and sifted for authenticity. Only those deemed genuine, worthy of the gods, were preserved. From this mosaic of sources, a new collection was assembled, a restored Sibylline corpus. In this act of reconstruction lay both resilience and invention. Rome would not allow its fate to burn away with the temple. By gathering prophecies from across cultures, it reinforced its openness to foreign traditions, the very trait the original books had demanded. But there was also invention. For who could say whether the verses preserved now were truly the same as those purchased by Tarquinius centuries earlier? The Sibylline books had always thrived on secrecy, and now that secrecy allowed their rebirth, the people did not question too deeply. It was enough to know that the books had been restored. The new collection was housed once more in the rebuilt Temple of Jupiter, entrusted to the guardians, and treated with the same reverence as before. To the people, the continuity was unbroken. The Sibylline books had survived fire and ruin, just as Rome itself had survived. Their destruction had only proven their indestructibility, for in some form they returned, their voice echoing once again in the city's crises. In a way, the fire had only deepened their mystique, proving that prophecy, like Rome, could endure even when the world seemed to collapse. But the episode also revealed something more subtle. The Sibylline books were not a fixed set of words, but a living tradition. They could be remade, reshaped, reinterpreted. Their authority lay not in their original parchment, but in the belief that they embodied divine truth. As long as Rome believed, the books could not truly die. They were eternal, even if their material form was fragile. This flexibility allowed them to remain relevant, even as centuries passed and Rome itself transformed from republic to empire. The restored books continued to guide the city. When floods swelled, the Tiber or pestilence stalked the streets, the priests still turned to the scrolls. Their advice, as always, pointed to rituals, purifications, and the importation of gods. With each consultation, the idea that Rome was under divine guidance deepened. The books were no longer just relics, they were symbols of Rome's ability to rise from destruction. If the gods had allowed them to be burned, the gods had also willed their return. This belief carried weight during the Republic's final century, when civil wars tore the city apart, as generals fought for power, as armies marched on Rome itself. The Sibylline books remained a quiet constant, a reminder that the gods still spoke through ritual, even when men turned against each other. The Senate and priests used them sparingly, but their presence was enough. In times of chaos, the books offered continuity, the sense that beyond the blood and ambition, there was still a divine plan. It is easy to imagine the scene: the guardians entering the temple at dusk, torches flickering against the walls, the air heavy with smoke from sacrifices. They would unroll the fragile scrolls written in Greek verse, their words older than the city itself. In the silence, they searched for meaning, for a line that could be brought back to the Senate as divine command. Outside, the people waited anxiously, hoping the books would give an answer to their fears. It was ritual as much as revelation, a performance of divine order in the midst of human disorder. And yet their very restoration raised questions. Were these truly the same words the old woman had offered? Or had Rome, in its desperation, crafted something new under the guise of continuity? Perhaps it did not matter. What mattered was belief, and belief was unshaken. The Sibylline books were still there, still guiding, still preserving the illusion of permanence in a world of constant change. They had become more than scrolls. They were Rome's collective faith, written not just in ink, but in imagination. In the years that followed, the Sibylline books played their part as before, prescribing new rites, new gods, new ceremonies. The cult of Apollo flourished, the Great Mother's drums still sounded, and festivals multiplied. Each edition was traced back to the scrolls, and in this way, the books continued to expand Rome's religious horizon. Their authority was never diminished by the fire. If anything, it was amplified. For what survived destruction must surely be touched by divinity. Thus the books passed into the late Republic, their legend burnished by fire and renewal. They were more than parchments hidden in a vault. They were proof that Rome's destiny could not be undone, not by war, not by flame, not even by time itself. And as ambitious men like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar strode across the stage of history, the Sibylline books remained in their temple, silent until called upon, waiting for the next great crisis to demand their voice. The fall of the Republic and the rise of Augustus marked a turning point not only for Rome's politics, but for the Sibylline books as well. Where once they had served as the city's secret counselors in times of communal crisis, now they became instruments in the hands of emperors who wished to cloak their rule in divine sanction. Augustus, shrewd and deliberate, understood the power of symbols. He rebuilt the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus after civil war had left the city scarred, and he made certain the Sibylline books were safe within its vaults. To him, they were not just relics, They were a reminder to the people that Rome was still guided by the gods, even under new rulers. Augustus took no chances. He ordered the collection of prophecies gathered after the fire of 83 BCE to be carefully reviewed. Some were destroyed, others preserved. Only those that aligned with his vision of Rome's destiny remained. In this act, he reshaped the Sibylline tradition to serve his empire. What had once been a mysterious, independent voice of the gods was now carefully curated to echo imperial ideology. Yet to the people, the books remained what they had always been: divine guidance, sealed in sacred scrolls. Under Augustus, the Sibylline books were consulted on matters that stretched beyond the emergencies of the Republic. The emperor himself called upon them, and when omens unsettled the city, he used their verses to justify religious reforms. In times of plague or famine, the books prescribed rituals of purification, but now those rituals were bound up with imperial authority. To obey the Sibylline books was to obey Augustus, and to disobey Augustus was to resist the gods themselves. It was a seamless weaving of prophecy and power. Yet the verses retained their obscurity, their ambiguity. They were never proclamations of political decree, but riddling lines of poetry that could be bent toward the needs of the moment. Augustus and his successors understood this well. The scrolls did not change, the interpretations did. And so, while the books remained locked in their vault, their voice echoed across the empire, shaped by the lips of priests and rulers alike. One of the most striking episodes came during Augustus's reign. When a terrible famine struck Rome, the people cried out for relief, and the Sibylline books were consulted. Their verses commanded the establishment of new rituals and the importation of additional deities to Rome's ever-growing pantheon. Augustus complied, but he also used the crisis to reinforce his role as the city's savior. The books had spoken, yes, but it was Augustus who carried out their commands. In this way, the Sibylline tradition became inseparable from imperial propaganda. The ambiguity of the verses also created room for stories that reached far beyond Rome. In later centuries, coy Christian writers would claim that the Sibylline books had foretold the coming of Christ, seizing upon their cryptic nature as proof of divine anticipation. Whether true or not, this shows how deeply the aura of prophecy lingered around the scrolls. They were seen not just as guardians of Rome, but as fragments of a universal truth, a voice that might speak to all nations. Still, in the practical life of the empire, their role remained consistent. Plague, invasion, earthquake, famine, whenever calamity struck, the priests of the books were summoned. In the 2nd century BCE, they had brought in Cybele. In the age of Augustus, they reinforced Apollo's worship. Later emperors would continue this pattern, importing rites and gods at the book's command. The scrolls were thus a bridge not only between men and gods, but between Rome and the many cultures it absorbed. The guardians of the books, the quindecimviri sacris faciandis, became an institution of empire. To be chosen as one of the 15 was an honor, a sign of prestige, and also a reminder of the heavy burden of secrecy. They were still the only ones who could read the scrolls. To others, the Sibylline books were mere rumor, invisible but omnipresent, a shadow of the divine hidden in the heart of the city. The priests, with their guarded interpretations, held one of the quietest yet most enduring sources of influence in Rome. Even emperors approached the books with caution. Augustus had shaped them to his ends, but he never claimed to control them outright. They remained separate, higher, a divine mystery beyond mortal grasp. Leaning too heavily upon them was dangerous, for their obscurity could also undermine as easily as it could support. The emperors who followed him respected this balance, using the books when needed, but never allowing them to speak too often. Too much prophecy could weaken their power. Secrecy gave them weight. By this time, centuries after their first arrival, the Sibylline books had become something more than prophecy. They were symbols of continuity, the assurance that Rome was still aligned with the divine. When the people heard that the books had been consulted, they felt steadied, as though the gods themselves had reached down to steady the city's hand. Whether the instructions involved sacrifices, games, or the adoption of foreign cults, the act itself was reassurance. It meant Rome was not abandoned. It is here that one sees the paradox most clearly. The Sibylline books were fragile, easily destroyed by fire or decay. They had already been remade once, their authenticity impossible to prove, and yet their power was undeniable, because it was built not on parchment but on belief. Rome believed the books were divine, and that belief gave them more strength than any army or wall. They were a myth that lived, not in words, but in the trust of a people who saw themselves as chosen. And so, as Augustus's empire stretched across the seas, the Sibylline Books remained in their vault, silent, mysterious, eternal. They were not read every day, not even every year, but they were always there, waiting. In their secrecy lay Rome's confidence. In their obscurity lay its faith. They had survived kings, republics, and now stood as counselors to emperors. But in the centuries to come, their silence would become heavier, their mystery deeper, till finally their voice was heard no more. As the centuries of empire rolled forward, the Sibylline Books remained locked within their chamber on the Capitoline Hill. Silent, unless the Senate and the Emperor called upon them. They were not a daily presence in Roman life, but more like a hidden reservoir, a spring drawn upon only when drought threatened. For long stretches of stability they were untouched, left to their guardians, their verses gathering dust in the darkness. Yet their silence did not diminish their importance. If anything, it gave them greater weight, for when they did speak, all of Rome listened. During the height of imperial power in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Rome had fewer occasions to seek the books. The legions secured the borders. Trade flourished. The streets swelled with goods from every corner of the known world. Temples rose higher, games grew grander, and the people basked in the confidence of empire. Yet even in times of abundance, omens continued to appear. Earthquakes rattled the ground. Lightning struck shrines. Floods spilled into the forum. Each was seen as a warning. A whisper of divine displeasure, and sometimes these whispers drove the guardians once more to unroll the scrolls. The verses still spoke in riddles. Sometimes they commanded purification rituals, processions through the city with offerings to Jupiter or Mars. At other times, they demanded something more, the introduction of new deities, the building of shrines, or the expansion of festivals. These demands were never light. They carried the weight of divine necessity, and to disobey would have been unthinkable. Even emperors, who ruled with near-absolute power, dared not ignore the Sibylline Books once they had spoken. And yet their very obscurity continued to raise questions. Only the guardians read them. The people never did. Were the verses truly commanding these acts? Or were the priests bending them to suit imperial aims? Whispers of doubt existed, but they rarely spread far. Most Romans preferred not to question. It's better to believe the gods had spoken than to dwell on the possibility of human manipulation. The mystery was part of the book's power, and without it, their authority might have collapsed. By the reign of Augustus's successors, the books were no longer purely about survival. They were about legitimacy. To claim that the Sibylline Books supported a decision was to clothe it in divine approval. They were not cited lightly, for overuse would have eroded their mystique. But in moments when emperors needed to reassure the city after a plague, after a rebellion, after a natural disaster, the announcement that the Sibylline Books had been consulted carried immense symbolic weight. It told the people that even the highest rulers were subject to divine will. One of the most dramatic examples came in the reign of Emperor Claudius. When famine struck and grain ships from Egypt failed to arrive, panic spread through the city. Claudius turned to the Sibylline Books. Their verses urged the establishment of new rites and supplications to the gods of fertility. He complied, and when the grain supply was restored, the connection seemed certain in the minds of the people. The books had spoken, and Rome had survived once again. This pattern repeated through the centuries. Plague under Marcus Aurelius, floods under later emperors. Strange celestial signs all prompted recourse to the books. Each time rituals were performed, sacrifices made, new cults integrated. Rome's religion, already vast and inclusive, continued to expand, always with the Sibylline Books at the heart of change. They were a quiet engine of transformation, ensuring that Rome never stagnated, that its spiritual life remained as dynamic as its empire. But as the empire grew, so too did the distance between the people and the mysteries of the books. In the Republic, the Senate had been the intermediary. Now it was the emperor, whose word carried divine weight on its own. The Sibylline Books still mattered, but their authority was subtly overshadowed by the emperor's personal aura. Augustus had used them to reinforce his legitimacy. Later emperors sometimes treated them as one tool among many, not as the ultimate anchor of Rome's survival. The guardians still existed, the quindecimviri sacris faciendis, but their role was quieter. They remained part of Rome's sacred fabric, a reminder that deep within the Capitoline temple lay verses older than empire, older than republic, older even than kings. Yet as centuries passed, fewer people could recall the details of their origin. The story of the old woman at Rome's gates faded into legend, half remembered by scholars and poets, no longer alive in the hearts of ordinary citizens. The books had become part of the city's hidden memory, sacred but increasingly distant, and perhaps that distance was inevitable. Rome was now vast, stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from Britain to Africa. Its gods were everywhere, its rituals countless. The Sibylline Books were no longer the sole bridge between mortals and the divine. They were one voice among many in an empire teeming with faiths. Still, their presence persisted, woven into the city's rhythm, summoned in moments when the empire itself seemed to falter. It was in those moments of silence between crises that their aura deepened. The people rarely saw them, rarely heard of them, but they knew they were there. Like a hidden heartbeat, the Sibylline Books remained in the background, steady and eternal. Their very secrecy was their strength. The less they were consulted, the more powerful they seemed, for each word carried centuries of accumulated weight. And yet, time is relentless. The empire that once seemed eternal began to tremble. Invasions pressed harder at the borders, plagues thinned the population, and emperors rose and fell with frightening speed. It was in this new age of instability that the Sibylline Books would be summoned once more. Their verses unrolled in a world far darker than the one in which they had first spoken. By the 3rd century CE, the empire was no longer the unshakable giant it had once been. Civil wars erupted with alarming frequency. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, and enemies pressed harder at the borders. Plagues and famines stalked the land, and the sense of divine order that had long sustained Rome began to waver. In such times, the Sibylline Books regained prominence. When chaos spread, the guardians were called upon, their hands trembling as they unrolled the fragile scrolls by the flicker of temple lamps. The verses, as always, were obscure. They spoke in riddles, fragments of Greek poetry layered with ambiguity. Some lines urged purification rituals, others demanded the worship of neglected gods, and still others called for the introduction of foreign rites. In times of stability, these demands might have seemed eccentric or excessive, but in an age of fear, they were obeyed without question. For Rome, struggling to survive, could not afford to ignore any voice that might be divine. The guardians, the quindecimviri, sacris faciendis, still held their secretive role, but by now the empire's political instability made their position more precarious. Emperors sought legitimacy wherever they could find it, and a favorable prophecy from the Sibylline Books could be a powerful tool. At times, it seemed less like the books guided the city, and more like they were guided by the needs of rulers desperate for divine sanction. Yet their aura endured, for the people believed. In a world where everything else felt uncertain, the books still carried the weight of eternity. One of the darkest episodes came during the mid-3rd century, when plague swept through the empire with devastating force. Corpses filled the streets, fields lay untended, and despair gnawed at every corner of society. The Sibylline Books were consulted, and the verses urged the performance of rites to Apollo and other healing deities. Temples were filled with prayers, incense clouded the air, and sacrifices were offered in abundance. The plague did not vanish, but the rituals gave people hope, a sense that the gods had not fully abandoned them. In this way, the books served not only as prophecy, but as medicine for the soul. But faith was not enough to stop the tide of decline. The empire fractured, provinces declared independence, and foreign armies crossed borders with growing confidence. Rome itself trembled. It was during these years that whispers spread of Sibylline prophecies, foretelling disaster verses that spoke of collapse, of cities falling, of fire-consuming empires. Whether these lines were genuine or inventions of fearful minds is impossible to know. But they circulated all the same, darkening the aura of the books. What had once been guides to survival were now seen by some as heralds of doom. The tension between secrecy and fear grew sharper. The priests still guarded the scrolls, still claimed to reveal only what was necessary, but in times of panic, rumors flourished. People speculated about what the books contained. Some insisted they foretold the end of Rome itself, a prophecy too terrible to reveal. Others believed the verses promised survival if only the people performed the right rites. The ambiguity gave the Sibylline Books a new, almost apocalyptic power. Meanwhile, new religions were rising within the empire. Mystery cults spread, offering personal salvation in ways Rome's traditional rituals never had. Christianity, still a small but growing movement, began to whisper its own prophecies of the end of empires and the coming of new divine orders. Against these rising voices, the Sibylline Books remained aloof, their guardians maintaining secrecy, their verses still veiled in Greek poetry. But their monopoly on prophecy was weakening. For the first time in centuries, Rome's people could look elsewhere for divine guidance. Yet the books still carried weight in the eyes of emperors. When Alaric and his Goths threatened Italy in the early 5th century, the Senate turned once again to the Sibylline Books. Their verses commanded elaborate sacrifices and new rituals, desperate measures to ward off invasion, but the rituals failed to halt the tide. In 410 CE, Alaric entered Rome, and the Eternal City was sacked for the first time in 800 years. The Sibylline Books, once the guardians of destiny, now seemed powerless before the storm of history. This failure shook faith in them. For centuries, their verses had been believed to preserve Rome against every threat. But now, the city had fallen, its walls breached, its treasures looted. The books had been consulted, but they had not saved the city. The silence of the gods hung heavy in the aftermath. To some, the books were still sacred, misunderstood, but divine. To others, they were empty parchment, relics of a past that no longer spoke to the present. And yet their aura did not vanish entirely. Even in decline, Rome could not wholly abandon the Sibylline Books. They were too deeply woven into the city's identity, too sacred to discard. To destroy them outright would have been an act of sacrilege. So they remained, hidden in their vault, consulted occasionally. Their authority weakened, but not erased. They were no longer Rome's shield, but they were still Rome's shadow, the lingering echo of centuries of faith. It is striking how the books endured even when their prophecies failed. Perhaps it was because they had never promised certainty, only guidance. Or perhaps it was because their very obscurity shielded them from blame. When the city fell, people could argue that the verses had been misinterpreted, not that the books had lied. The fault lay with men, never with the scrolls. This flexibility allowed their presence to linger even as the empire collapsed around them. But the world was changing. Christianity was rising, old temples were closing, and the rituals once commanded by the Sibylline Books were giving way to new forms of worship. The empire itself was dividing, east and west, pulling apart, each searching for survival in its own way. In this new world, the Sibylline Books felt increasingly like relics, whispers from an age when Rome believed its destiny was bound to parchment hidden in a temple vault. Their end was near, though few at the time could have foreseen how final it would be. By the 5th century CE, the Roman Empire in the West was a shadow of its former self. Once the mistress of the world, Rome now struggled even to defend Italy from invaders. The Senate still met, the emperors still sat on their thrones, but the grandeur of Augustus and Trajan had long since faded. In this age of desperation, the Sibylline Books were still guarded in their vault, still treated as sacred, though their voice grew fainter with each passing year. The rise of Christianity reshaped the religious landscape of Rome. Temples to Jupiter and Apollo grew quiet, their rituals fading, while churches spread across the city. Bishops now held the influence that priests of the old gods once commanded. Yet the Sibylline Books remained in the custody of the Senate, guardians of a pagan past that would not entirely vanish. They were still consulted on rare occasions, for even Christian emperors hesitated to destroy them outright. To erase them seemed to risk angering whatever gods still lingered in their pages. But the world was shifting. The sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 had shaken the faith of many. The Sibylline Books had been consulted, rituals performed, but the city had fallen regardless. To some, this was proof that the old gods had abandoned Rome, their power eclipsed by the Christian God. To others, It was a sign that men had misinterpreted the verses, failing to follow their guidance properly. In either case, the aura of the books dimmed. They were no longer Rome's unquestioned shield. Still, the Senate clung to them. In times of famine or plague, when the emperor permitted, the guardians unrolled the fragile scrolls once more, seeking a line that might restore balance. The rituals they commanded were often half-hearted by now, for the city no longer had the resources or devotion to carry them out fully. But the act itself, the consultation, still carried symbolic weight. It was a reminder of continuity, of the ancient bond between Rome and the gods who had once guided her rise. Yet their very survival became precarious. The new Christian rulers of Rome saw the Sibylline Books not as sacred treasures, but as remnants of pagan superstition. Some bishops called for their destruction, urging that no trace of the old faith remain. The Senate resisted, clinging to the last fragments of tradition, but the pressure mounted. What had once been Rome's greatest safeguard was now seen by many as a threat to the new order of faith. In 399 CE, an imperial decree had already ordered the suppression of many pagan practices, and whispers circulated that the Sibylline Books might soon be targeted. The guardians kept them hidden, their secrecy now not only a matter of ritual, but of survival. To reveal too much was dangerous. To lose them was unthinkable. For centuries, the books had been consulted only in moments of crisis, but now their very existence had become a crisis of faith. The end came in the reign of the Christian Emperor Theodosius II. At his command, the Sibylline Books were ordered to be burned. The act was final and deliberate, an attempt to sever Rome once and for all from its pagan heritage. The guardians, who for centuries had protected the scrolls with their lives, could do nothing. The verses that had guided Rome through famine, plague, and invasion were consigned to flames, their smoke rising into the sky, just as 6 scrolls had long ago in the hands of the mysterious woman. For Rome, it was a moment of profound loss. The Sibylline Books had been more than parchment. They had been a symbol of destiny, a voice of the divine that had guided the city for nearly 1,000 years. Their destruction was not just the end of a tradition, the end of an idea that Rome's fate was written, preserved, and could be revealed in times of need. The books had begun in fire, and they ended in fire, a circle closed by flames. Yet even in their destruction, the Sibylline Books did not vanish entirely. Fragments of their verses lingered, quoted in histories, echoed in memory. Some said they had foretold disasters that had come to pass. Others claimed they had pointed to events still unfolding. Later generations, especially Christians, would claim that the Sibyls had prophesied the coming of Christ, weaving the old pagan oracles into the fabric of a new faith. The books lived on, if not in scrolls, then in imagination. There is something haunting about their end. For centuries they had been hidden, preserved through wars, fires, and invasions, only to be deliberately erased by the hands of men. They had been too sacred for the people to read, too obscure for the Senate to question, too powerful for emperors to ignore. And yet, in the end, they were fragile, vulnerable to the flames of decree. The gods who had once spoken through them fell silent as the scrolls crumbled to ash. But perhaps this was fitting. The Sibylline Books had always been bound to mystery. No one ever saw them fully. No one ever knew their complete contents. They were a voice half heard, a light glimpse through smoke. To be lost in flames was to return to that mystery, to vanish once more into the unknown. Their end was not a contradiction of their power, but its final expression in oracle that had always lived in secrecy returning to silence. And so, as the Western Empire staggered toward collapse, the Sibylline Books were gone. The Senate that had once cherished them dwindled, temples that had housed them crumbled, and a new faith rose in their place. Yet their story endured, whispered by historians and poets, remembered as one of Rome's strangest and most sacred treasures. They had begun with a woman at the gates, scrolls in her hands, and fire in her eyes. They ended with flames consuming their words, leaving only echoes for the centuries to come. When the Sibylline Books were burned under Theodosius, it was not only scrolls that vanished, but centuries of ritual, secrecy, and trust. For nearly 1,000 years, they had been the hidden voice of Rome, consulted in darkness and revealed only in fragments. Their destruction marked the end of a bond between the city and its gods, a bond that had begun with a mysterious woman offering 9 scrolls at the gates. What had been purchased so reluctantly by Tarquinius had become one of Rome's most enduring treasures, only to vanish in fire once more. And yet their influence did not end with their ashes. Stories of the Sibylline Books lingered in chronicles, woven into the writings of Livy, Cicero, and later Christian authors. The memory of their verses endured, even when the scrolls themselves were gone. They were said to have guided Rome through famine, plague, and war, to have demanded the worship of Apollo, Cybele, and countless others. They had shaped the city's religious landscape, turning Rome into the great absorber of gods. Their power had not lain in clear predictions, but in their ability to demand change, to make Rome stretch its identity in order to survive. In later centuries, Christians claimed that the Sibyls had foreseen Christ. Medieval manuscripts sometimes included Sibylline prophecies that were reinterpreted through the lens of Christianity, as though the pagan past had always pointed forward to the Christian present. In this way, the Sibylline Books found a strange afterlife. Though their verses were gone, their aura of prophecy was too potent to fade completely. They were reshaped into symbols of continuity, bridging the old world and the new. But for historians, the fascination lies in their secrecy. Unlike the epics of Homer or the histories of Herodotus, the Sibylline Books were never open to all. They were not meant to be read widely, only consulted in shadows, their meanings filtered through guardians and senators. This secrecy was both their strength and their weakness. It gave them mystique, made them unquestionable, but it also left them vulnerable to manipulation. The books lived in a space between faith and politics, never entirely one or the other, and perhaps that is why they continue to capture imagination. Prophecy is always uncertain, always ambiguous. A clear prediction can be proven false, but a riddle endures. The Sibylline Books thrived on riddles, on verses that could be bent and reshaped, applied to one crisis after another. They spoke not in certainties, but in possibilities, leaving men to decide what they meant. In that space of uncertainty lay their true power. Their story also reflects Rome itself. Like the city, they were resilient, surviving fires and wars only to be rebuilt and restored. Like the empire, they absorbed influences from many cultures, weaving Greek, Anatolian, and Italian elements into a single fabric. And like Rome, they eventually fell, undone not by external disaster alone, but by the weight of transformation. Their destruction under Theodosius mirrored the collapse of the old Roman religion, swept aside by a faith that offered new promises. Still, the image of their end is striking. One can imagine the guardians who had carried the burden of secrecy for generations, watching as the scrolls were burned by imperial order. What must they have felt? Relief, perhaps, that their sacred duty was at last lifted, or despair that the voice they had guarded for centuries was silenced forever. The books had outlasted kings, republics, and emperors, but they could not outlast the will of history. And yet, in silence, they endure. We remember them, though we cannot read them, tell their story, though their verses are lost. The Sibylline Books have become a symbol of lost wisdom, of knowledge glimpsed, but never fully grasped. Their absence is as haunting as their presence once was. They remind us that history is filled with voices half heard, treasures lost to fire, secrets buried in time. Perhaps that is their final prophecy, not a prediction of events, but a lesson about knowledge itself, that wisdom can be offered and rejected, preserved and destroyed, hidden and revealed, yet never fully possessed. The Sibylline Books were never meant to give simple answers. They existed to remind Rome that survival required humility, change, and faith in mysteries greater than itself. Their destruction does not erase that lesson. If anything, it makes it sharper. And so, the Sibylline Books linger in our imagination, not as parchment, but as myth. A woman at the gates of Rome, scrolls in her hands, flames rising into the sky, priests descending into temple vaults, unrolling fragile verses by torchlight, emperors bending their riddles to shape an empire, and at the end, the fire that consumed them, leaving only smoke and silence. These are the images that remain, fragments of a story that stretches across 1,000 years. For those who seek comfort in sleep, Sibylline Books can be heard as a whisper across centuries, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity has always sought guidance, always looked for patterns in the storm, always hoped for voices that speak beyond the mortal. Whether their prophecies were true or false matters less than the fact that they gave people encouraging, and a sense that life had meaning in the hands of the divine. And so we end where we began, with mystery. The Sibylline books are gone, their verses lost, their guardians silent. But their story endures, carried by memory, by history, by the dream that's somewhere hidden still. The voice of the gods waits to be heard. As you drift into rest, imagine the quiet vault beneath the temple, the scrolls resting in shadows, their words unread but eternal. They are gone, but in the silence of night their echoes remain.